on talking about how New Zealand is, and every year, I hope you enjoy it. Every
Now Fiddler puts on the step, goes right through, puts on the step again. Oh, goes Freddie. That was magnificent stuff. Well, they shall not weary them. Parcels gets away, Parcels still going. Mullins opens up again. Oh, look at him go. He beats O'Davis on the outside.
Hello and welcome to another exciting episode of The Voluntary Tackle, the only NRL podcast prepared to blame Kenny Rogers for the outbreak of COVID-19. All I'm saying is he's been pretty silent on the issue this week. I'm your host, Aimon Brown, and today on the show we'll be discussing the future of the NRL in the wake of being suspended and all of the diseased craziness that has plagued our great game in between. And for once, I'm not talking about Jared Hayne. But first, joining me via a really long piece of string with empty soup cans on the end, it's Xander Risotto. Welcome to the show, mate.
Thanks, Aimon. Good to virtually be with you.
Mate, now this is obviously the first time we've ever attempted to conduct the show remotely like this because of the current conditions. Mainly because I didn't want you in my house, mate. Don't take it personally. But you were sneezing and coughing a lot. So we thought it was best to potentially use the phone. A bit like, in the early 90s, people used to call each other on the phone a lot and have long conversations with each other before they just started sort of sending each other dick pics. I feel like we're back there again.
Yeah, I mean, it's strange that it's taken until this particular point, though. I do feel that, when I was struggling to speak and probably at my most contagious, would have been the wiser just purely from a containment standpoint. But, look, live and learn, I guess. We're a little bit like the New South Wales government with the cruise ship.
That's right, mate. We
them all off.
We soldiered on in the face of adversity, didn't we? We said, no, we're not going to stop our podcast, which brings in no revenue, for the sake of the health system in New South Wales. We thought, no, we're going to soldier on and talk about rugby league until it dies. And yet, here we are, we're still talking about it even after it's dead. So here we are.
Allegedly, according to the Telegraph at least.
That's right. Now, look, I don't know if there's going to be any limitations with conducting a show like this over the phone, apart from the fact that I am holding my mobile phone up to a microphone and no doubt will have a dead bicep muscle in about 25 minutes because I'm extremely unfit. But outside of that obvious caveat, I did think it was a bit weird trying to create something from a distance like this. I feel a bit like an inmate trying to smuggle out sperm to a lover on the outside. It's just a weird feeling.
Yeah, that's one way to put it.
How are you
coping? Not the analogy I would have gone with.
Well, because that way my seed, mate, because I'm incarcerated, so my seed can go forth and prosper in the ovaries of many other women.
I'm not sure if that's exactly how it works, but
probably not.
Whatever, I guess, makes you feel at home while you're at home.
Mate, I want to know, before we kick into the show, there's a lot of rugby league talk to discuss. How are you handling COVID-19, mate? Obviously, we've all been locked away into our respective wardrobes. How are you dealing with the crisis?
Yeah, technically my office is still open, but I think we have a presumptive work from home condition now where they've basically told us that unless you have a face-to-face meeting, you've got to come in. You've got to work from home.
My office did the same thing. They said you can work from home permanently because we're out of business. So in a way, I thought uber flexible. It was very nice of them. But at some stage, I would have liked to have returned. But you can't win everything.
Yeah, sadly, there's been a bit of that. There's a Centrelink up the road from my place, and Jesus Christ, I don't think I've ever seen it look quite like that. It reminds you of photos from the Depression. It's a bit messed up.
It is, mate. And I don't know if you had the same impression as I did. I remember watching that on the news, going, wow, the irony of having so many people grouped in the one space at a time when we've been told that we have to social distance. They're there because of social distancing, and yet they're in a crowd. Kind of weird.
Yeah, actually, it hadn't even occurred to me, but you're 100% right. It's quite a cruel irony, that.
Now, mate, I don't know. I don't have a firm grasp of germ theory, obviously, so I don't know the ins and outs of avoiding this disease specifically. But from my understanding, I've done a bit of research. I think the best thing you can do is actually wear a snorkel. Have you heard that?
No, I don't believe that. I think that's probably wrong.
I don't know, mate. I got it from One Nation's website. It has to be right.
I was going to say, I've seen a few tweets about that sort of thing, which leads me to believe it's probably wrong.
What is your social distancing technique like? Have you hit the streets? Are you taking the active measures to avoid other people? It's meant to be 1.5 metres now. I think they're pushing it out to 2.
I've taken it to extremes. I actually have a bubble that I walk around in, like those things you see people roll down hills in.
One of those Zorb balls.
Shows, like American. Yeah. I've been getting around in one of those. Makes shopping a little bit challenging, got to say.
I'll say, but the point where you get up to the checkout would be the point that I'd like to tune into the day in the life of Xander Risotto then, because you're in a giant Zorb ball. Presumably, you've got your groceries attached to the outside, and then you're trying to pay. How do you do that?
That's right. Well, PayWave, mate. PayWave.
Of course, actually. That makes a whole lot of sense.
I just cover the ball in a sticky substance and I just kind of roll it to the aisles that I'm at and just a bit like Lucky Dip. I just hope that something that I want sticks.
I had the same idea once where I made myself a Velcro suit and I walked around trying desperately to attach myself to another person in a crowded space. It didn't end up well, obviously. I am a convicted sex offender technically now. But, as an ideas man, these things are important.
No comment.
Now, mate, mine's actually quite effective. You going around to the Zorb ball, I've actually been going down and I've been practicing my roundhouse kick. I'm a bit like Chun-Li out of Street Fighter at the moment. I just walk around doing these sort of perfect 360-degree roundhouses. And it's been particularly effective when I've been going to the supermarkets during the pensioners-only time. We probably should kick into some NRL. Now, Xander, the last time we spoke, the world hadn't ended yet. The NRL was on a respirator. But since that time, some industries have fallen apart. But worse still, mate, the NRL has died. How did you feel when you first heard the news?
Well, it's not quite dead, right? I mean, it's sort of slipped into a coma, a little bit like a COVID-19 patient. But it's, at the moment, I think the respirator is still functioning. I'm just, I'm still holding out hope. Is kind of how I'm taking it. I still read every single article about like a contingency plan that may still see them go to Queensland, and the Queensland government saying the 14-day quarantine period won't apply to them if they use charter planes and all this kind of stuff. So I'm still consuming all of that stuff, probably unrealistically holding out hope at this stage. The short version is I think you'd say I'm in denial.
I love it. And do you know what I love about Peter V'landys is you're right. He's definitely like a Bond villain, isn't he? He seems to have at least 35 plans. Instead of to blow up the world, it's to keep the NRL going. And I guess to say he's an ideas man. I mean, most of them are abjectly ridiculous, but I appreciate the fact that he's trying, Xander.
Yeah, and I guess like a Bond villain, probably stands to reason that none of them worked.
He's been foiled by, although the person he's been foiled in this case is a disease as opposed to an arrogant Scotsman, which is important. So you're saying the very first time that you heard the news, you weren't immediately glum? Because I literally, my heart sort of melted when I heard it. Do you know how sometimes people say to you, you feel so happy, you almost ejaculate? Well, mine was the opposite of that. All of my cum cells died instantly.
Sorry, nobody's ever. I guess we move in different circles, but nobody's ever expressed quite that level of happiness to me. Maybe I just don't have that effect on people. But yeah, anyway.
Well, it's inconvenient, mate. I mean, I am the type that can inspire a good ejaculation in people, particularly in business meetings. If I put a really cogent argument in place. But as I said, it is inconvenient. People generally react badly to that. But no, I had the exact opposite effect because that's how sad I was. I felt as though every cum cell had died instantly. Like basically, my balls had been carpet bombed. Imagine this. Each of my balls were effectively like the Twin Towers in 2001. It was a really tough moment.
So moving on.
Well, look, the first question, if we are to move on, if we have to, I guess the first question should be this. Was the NRL right, Xander, to suspend the comp?
I don't know if it's a question of right or wrong. I think at this point they were just left with no choice. Queensland were about to close its borders. I think, frankly, even the contingency plan to send everyone to Queensland was going to be logistically super challenging. Like it's not just the players, right? It's all of the coaching staff, the health staff,
the schoolgirls.
Housed. That's just Ockenbaugh and his mate, though, right? It's just a couple of them. But all in all, the staff relating to each NRL club, I saw estimates that it would be something like 1,600 to 2,000 people that they need to house in a regional town, and then keep that going for 24 weeks potentially. Yeah, it was going to be pretty hard. So maybe, I'd have liked to have seen them work it out and try and push on regardless. And consider it a little bit like, I don't know, scientists who sign up to go and do research in Antarctica.
That's
not
it.
ideal
Make a giant
circumstances.
commitment. Yeah, I love that idea.
Yeah, but you know what I mean? Like, it's obviously going to require a huge sacrifice, but these are pretty extraordinary times. So I thought, well, if I were in their position and as a player, and the game had said that they were going to test everybody, quarantine everybody, be super stringent about all the requirements. Logically, it seemed to me that they'd probably be safer there than they would be in the general population. Whereas you say, people are contracting this quicker and quicker in the metropolitan areas, and they'd probably be at higher risk, ironically.
Yeah, even with all these self-isolation measures. I guess that was the idea, wasn't it? It was, as you said, it would have been a major logistical challenge. But the idea would have been to transplant the entire competition and its support arms to a remote area in Queensland, or at least to the one area where they didn't associate with the outside world, effectively insulating them from the prospect of contracting the virus. A very difficult challenge, and I think one that ultimately proved too much, especially when Queensland closed the borders. What do you think was the bigger force behind suspending the competition? Do you think it was the fact that Queensland made the decision to close its borders, or do you think it was the health advice?
It sounds like it was a bit of both. Reading the sort of tea leaves of it in the media reports that have come out to date, it sounds as if the borders was one straw, but they also received some independent health advice that tipped things over.
Well, we all know one man that was certainly happy that the competition was suspended. Big shout out to Peter FitzSimons, who it was a very odd day yesterday, Xander. Obviously, I had a busy day at work. The world's gone to shit, and as I said, work in travel, so a lot going on that day. Came home, I thought, ooh, what are these sort of at mentions on my Twitter profile? And I go in, and lo and behold, Peter FitzSimons, of all people, is calling me a weasel. It's a very odd moment of time.
You're welcome.
Yeah, and that's right. No, I believe it all started from you and your bloody Twitter account. So you roped me into essentially my first Twitter stoush with Peter FitzSimons, and he wasn't very charitable with me, I have to say. He called me a number of odd names, and often referred to himself in the third person. I found that just as odd. But tell me how all that happened. I was actually at a loss to how it all started.
Oh, well, I think I just had a crack at him for not mentioning the rugby union plans to launch an alternate kind of Super 5 contingency Australia-only competition because their comp had been cancelled.
And he didn't take that well, I take it.
Well, no, it was kind of funny. Like he conceded he hadn't heard of that, and he said he was talking about the NRL only because that was the topic that was on the top of everyone's minds. I said, well, given where you come from, it's probably incumbent on you to have a position on what, your favourite game is doing and planning to do in the current crisis. And his defence was that he hadn't heard of it until that particular moment, and that nobody was talking about rugby anyway.
Well, he's right about that.
He is, but I thought it was a bit weak because he didn't respond to this, but I did point out that it was reported on for a couple of days running in his paper, the Sydney Morning Herald, by Georgina Robinson, the rugby correspondent, the chief rugby correspondent there. I just kind of thought, well, that's a bit of a failure as a commentator and a journalist for him to not be across what's happening in other sports if he's going to be taking such strident positions on one that he has a history of bashing. Sorry, Xander, I was to say, so essentially what you're saying is you think he's taken a very narrow approach to abusing just the NRL
in what is a global health crisis and affecting all sports. And of course, he has a dog in the race, doesn't he? Because he used to play rugby union, and he has got an unfortunate history of singling out the NRL for criticism, I've noticed.
Yeah, and I think that's what it came down to. I mean, like, if you're going to argue the point, that's fine. It was probably more just the context, and I made that point a number of times. He never really responded as to the nature of the risk. Like, I asked for feedback a number of times. He didn't really provide a response to, I suppose, the statistical likelihood of the players being at risk in a regional area with no cases and players having all tested negative versus having them in the metropolitan area and just twiddling their thumbs. So I got the sense, and I made that point to him, that it was culturally driven rather than logically driven. But,
well, he clearly didn't like that, Xander, because then he turned his attention to me. Because I think what happened was I saw you make a comment, and knowing that Fitzy has had a history of singling out the NRL, I just made some quip and never thought about it again. I think I said something like, Fitzy be the type to have euthanised Far Lap during the Great Depression. I believe I said something like that, and he didn't like that too much. But look, he was essentially, we ended up getting into it through 4 or 5 tweets. It's a bit weird. But he was essentially attacking the idea that the NRL was seeking expert advice to make their policies. They obviously have recruited a pandemics expert, and it is a policy relating to disease control. I would have thought that'd be an entirely appropriate thing to do, but not according to Peter FitzSimons.
I didn't actually think that was the point he was making, to be completely fair. I thought it was...
It was in our exchange.
Okay. Well, I mean, the way I saw it, it was him simply just repeating the point over and over again that... Well, taking specific examples of people who are getting very sick, and then saying, how can you have the NRL continue playing, which to me seemed to be a bit of a non sequitur. I've seen a little bit of that online of late. I think that two things can be true at the same time. I think it can be true that that COVID-19 is an extremely serious thing that needs to be dealt with, but I also think it can be true that measures can be taken to quarantine and ensure a sport can continue safely.
Yeah, I didn't think they needed to be mutually exclusive either. And I think that was the weird point he was making. He was sort of saying you either have to be on one side or the other. You have to be a COVID-19 denier or want the NRL to stop. And of course, the NRL was proposing a fairly audacious plan. In the face of a known threat, they weren't ever denying that this was anything but a pandemic, where they could somehow keep the competition going and save thousands of jobs. Now, I would have thought that would be, on the face of it, a fairly positive thing to do if you could guarantee there would be no community risk. He didn't seem particularly interested in that line of argument, though, I think because he fucking hates the NRL, essentially.
Yeah, look, I mean, I don't want to be too presumptive, but I just got the sense that he wasn't willing to engage on those particular points. He was seeking to fight on a very narrow battleground that he thought he had moral authority, which I didn't think was particularly fair. I mean, for example, in one instance, he compared them wanting to play on to Alan Jones's flagrant misinformation campaigns, which I thought was kind of a dick move.
Oh, it's a cheap shot. Yeah, of course. I mean, the moment you compare anyone to Alan Jones, it's a cheap shot. It would have been a cheap shot to Mussolini because he has feelings too.
What's the term on the internet when
fuck knuckle?
Debate? No, the term used to describe how long it takes for somebody to revert to a Hitler comparison. But there's like a law pertaining to basically the speed and likelihood of a heated online debate causing somebody to invoke Hitler as a comparison for their adversary.
It does come up a lot, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I think because
there's a genuine law. Actually, it's kind of killing me. I feel like I need to look this up.
Well, mate, it could be the same principle as that Kevin Bacon game online. What is it? 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon. Eventually, all the roads lead back to Kevin Bacon. I've thought that in most of my endeavours in life, actually. Thankfully, not my sex life, but everything else, generally speaking. I just would have thought it would be a fairly non-outrageous comment to make, Xander, that if the NRL had employed experts and only based their policy on the back of what they say and what the government says, that it has every right to attempt to secure its own survival. But apparently, according to Peter FitzSimons, that is wrong. Those decisions are best left to retired rugby union players who excel at the Atkins diet, which is a bit weird. Apparently, they know best. Look, I really don't want to stay on Peter FitzSimons for too long, but I'll finish on this. Tell me if I'm wrong here.
Weren't we supposed to get him on the show?
Oh, I did invite him, and he said, only if I answer this question, and I did, and then he just never returned the offer. But that's all right, mate. I mean...
A future episode, perhaps.
Personally, I'd prefer to have Hitler on.
So that is actually... I've looked it up. It's Godwin's Law.
Godwin's Law, okay. Well, you know what? I'd normally store that in the memory banks, but I'm probably not going to need that.
Being online, I'm sure it'll come up again.
Look, this is a really cheap shot, but I feel like he took a lot of cheap shots on Twitter at me, so I'm going to finish on this one. To me... Peter FitzSimons does look like the product of Iggy Pop and Long John Silver. That's all I'm going to say. He looks like an anemic pirate. A pirate who's been stranded on a desert island after a mutiny and has decided he doesn't like the coconuts, so I'm just going to drink my own urine. That's what Peter FitzSimons looks like. No more cheap shots, I promise. Now,
always good to enter debate on the high ground.
If you are going to take the low road, at least be good at being a cunt. I've always said that. I think that was one of Confucius's proverbs, wasn't it?
You could have just ended with, he was a very low IQ individual, very low ratings. Nobody ever knew him. I never knew him.
Mate, you do quite a good trump. I've actually said that to you before. Your trump's quite good. Now, look, we'll go back to some NRL. I mean, sure, we'll pop back to some Fitzy bashing later. But for now, let's go to the NRL. The NRL came out today and said to the clubs, apparently, that it needs to play by September for the 2020 season to have any chance. What are your predictions? Obviously, it's tough to predict something in a health crisis like this because no one knows exactly when the end date is going to be of when we can sort of relax some of these lockout laws. But let's take a hypothetical here. Say the disease or the spread of the disease has subsided by September and we're able to play round 3 from the 1st. Is it possible to jam in a productive season plus State of Origin all by the end of the calendar year?
Yeah, it's possible. It's going to be a very difficult year, though, for the players that'll be playing right through summer, really, and also through the cricket season.
Yeah, but they'd be bludging all year. They'd be watching maths for 6 months.
Yeah, that's right. Jesus, I'd hate to see what it's going to do to the fitness of some of them, actually. Shout out to Latrell. Sorry.
I'd actually like to see NRL played, like the favourite, your favourite players who are now semi-obese because they've been locked away in home for 6 months, eating nothing but Cheetos and drinking beer. I'm wondering what that competition would look like. Imagine James Tedesco, but with a sort of rotund frame, the frame of sort of Danny DeVito. Tell me that's not entertaining.
Yeah, again, I think we kind of saw that on the weekend, in fact. Just that, that person only played for 57 minutes.
No, Latrell Mitchell, how do you think he'll go? Do you think that going to fullback is something that he can actually adjust to? Because at the moment he's a long way away, but that doesn't necessarily mean he'll never get there. What's your opinion?
Oh, no, I'm sure he can get there. He's only 22. I mean, I just don't think he's going to... He wasn't likely to have a smooth transition this year if this year was going to happen in a normal way. I just thought it was a premature move, and that's something that I think the first few games, because it's not just been round 1 and 2, it's been the Indigenous All-Stars game, it's been the Charity Shield, their trials, just hasn't been a smooth transition at all. I mean, he's not played a full game of fullback remotely.
No, in fact, he has played it remotely. He hasn't turned up to any of them.
That's right. And his contributions, I mean, a good, I think, contrast in the kind of focus and input required to really excel at that was, unfortunately for us, Tommy Turbo on the weekend for Manly. He was just everywhere. Tedesco's famous for doing that and being everywhere, but Trebojevic was just, scoring tries all over the field, saving tries, just in every single play imaginable.
See, I think there's a conspiracy at play there, Xander, because you're right, he was everywhere. But remember, he has a younger brother who looks exactly fucking like him. How do we know that he didn't have him on the field and there actually were like 3 Trebojeviches on the field at once. That's always a possibility. And plus, we know Manly cheat. Big shout out to Mario.
That's true. That's true. They're a scummy team that don't deserve to be in the comp.
Well, I didn't say that.
No,
you know what? Only Hitler would say that.
Yeah, big fan of Manly.
Well, here's the okay.
I wouldn't have been surprised actually. Like, I mean, geez, it felt like there was 2 of him.
Yeah, exactly. Well, look, I'm going to pose something else to you on the Latrell Mitchell thing, because you've mentioned this a few times, and I kind of feel like bringing up his age, he's only 22, is a bit of an out for him, because there are plenty of other players at his age that were putting in a lot more. They weren't well-rounded, polished players, but they were putting in. Latrell Mitchell, in the first 2 games, has hardly touched the ball in the first quarter of the match. It took 22 minutes in his round 1 match to touch the ball, literally. So his work rate is extremely low. This isn't just a case of someone learning his trade. For me, it's an attitude issue. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it partly is, and I think it's probably a byproduct of the fact that he is such a naturally gifted footballer.
So he's got a higher bar.
No, not so much that, but I think for somebody like him, where he's got great instincts, and when he's inserts himself into an attack, like he used to at centre for us, he can be so incredibly damaging when he picks those moments, because he's just got such incredible instincts and he's so powerful, that I actually think that perhaps for your more sort of workhorse, less flashy players,
your Corey Thompson.
Like those guys have to put in a way that somebody like Latrell, to get where he has gotten to in the NRL, maybe just hasn't needed to, and it's almost like an economizing thing where, maybe he's just not used to it. So I'm kind of agreeing with you that I think the effort hasn't been there, and I think that's because he's been able to be so successful up until now without doing that. I think these early rounds are kind of demonstrating the level of effort that he will be required to put in. And, he may well adjust to that, but it doesn't look like he has yet.
Look, reading between the lines, my take on certain things that Wayne Bennett, I was going to say was saying, it was more what he wasn't saying. I suspected he was probably going to move Latrell Mitchell back to centre on some kind of hybrid trial basis anyway, but potentially even fulfilling the Andrew Johns model, where he might play him at centre and sort of rotate him to fullback at certain stages of the game, because I don't think it's something that's tenable really to have a fullback brought across and only play for 55 minutes and go off to the bench. At the end of the day, he's trialling either Alex Johnson or Latrell Mitchell in that position. I think he's going to make a move to have one person slotted permanently there. And for me, it's Alex Johnson. I know he seems to cop a lot of shit, but I actually think he's a pretty fair player. He's sharp. He's evasive. He's got a great energy level. He's bloody fast. I mean, if you're going to say where is he lacking, it's I guess it's potentially in that skill factor, laying on tries, being the person who joins the line and is able to put other guys away. But I think that's something that can be crafted. And he's got the right attitude. For me, Latrell Mitchell, when he's firing, is one of the best centres in the world. I think they're sort of labouring under a false pretense there.
Yeah, I guess time will tell. The other interesting sort of caveat about this whole drama, though, for me, is that we discussed it the beginning of the year before we entered the zombie apocalypse here, and that is that he's only signed till a 1-year contract.
Yeah. How's that working out for him?
Yeah, if the competition doesn't happen this year, what does that mean for him? He won't have had a chance to prove himself at fullback, and the games that he'll have played won't have been particularly impressive. So where does it leave him from a contract standpoint?
Can he potentially impress the club in other ways? Could he go, well, okay, I can't really sort of show the club what I can do at fullback, but maybe I can become a really good groundskeeper. Maybe he can land Wayne Bennett a new missus. Maybe he can be the fucking ultimate wingman at like over 70s barbecues. I don't know, but I think Latrell Mitchell really is going to have to push the boat out here if he wants to get a contract upgrade.
I don't believe young blokes going to bars with old men is a particularly clever move.
Yeah, well, just to be malicious, Peter FitzSimons thinks that's a great idea.
I think it's going to be interesting to see how that whole contract saga unfolds. I'm curious what the implications are for him, because Wayne Bennett saying that he's going to be fullback and making really unequivocal, confident statements tends to be what Wayne does when he's about to do the exact opposite thing.
Exactly.
It's like saying, it's like in politics, a leader saying that I have absolutely no interest in running for the presidency or becoming prime minister or challenging the leader.
And then not even the next week, usually the next hour, they've been sworn in.
Yeah, exactly.
Look, as this show is, it's a bit of a curly show because we're doing this remotely, so there's a bit of experimentation going on. So why not just jam a Latrell Mitchell conversation in between these other topics that we're talking about? So I'm just going to do with no shameless segue whatsoever, head back to the current crisis facing the NRL, Xander, and I wanted to talk about these little ripple effects in the game, and I guess that they haven't really absorbed a lot of the media attention, but the attention's really been on the players. What do the players do now? How are the players going to survive? But of course, we know that the real tragedy is happening downstream. It's happening with all the support industries that rely on the NRL who are suddenly out of the job. And I came across an article actually, and forgive me, I can't think of the name of it. It's something that has whistle in the title, so I am trying to give you attribution. I'm sorry about that. But it was actually an interview with Gavin Badger. And he's an example of someone, right? He's been stood down. There are no games to referee. And his other job is a gym. So he's one of these guys that has gone from having two jobs, one a very successful one plus a side hustle, to being virtually unemployed. And that goes for his wife too, who does exactly the same two jobs as he does. The shutting down of this game, it's far beyond the players, isn't it?
Well, yeah, that's just it. And that is the point that's been made about the NRL's efforts to keep going, right? Is that it's not just the likes of, like a Daly Cherry Evans who's on $1 million a year that is going to be not being paid whilst there aren't games. It's not really those guys that people are worried about. It's about the thousands of support staff. Clubs will go under if the game is out too long. It's quite clear. Like, a lot of them really need that $13 million a week or whatever it is the competition gets every round to make sure that they remain solvent. It's a little unfortunate that it's come to this, that there aren't that many, there aren't enough in a solvent enough position, but it's just, these are paycheck to paycheck style businesses in a lot of ways.
I agree. And in Daly Cherry Evans's defence, mate, he has actually had to sack 2 of his slaves. So don't pretend for a second that he's not doing it tough as well. Well, you mentioned clubs might fall over there. I want to know, which ones do you think in the firing line? Now, I've read reports basically suggesting everyone, except for the Roosters, but who are in trouble. But the 3 candidates that keep coming back to me the most are Manly, the Sharks, and Penrith, of all places. I would have thought Penrith would actually be in a strong position, but I'm not intimately familiar with the books of all of these clubs. In your opinion, which clubs are in the most danger?
I haven't read Penrith. What I've read is the Titans, Manly, Canterbury, and the Tigers potentially.
Oh, the Tigers, yeah. I mean, but how are these clubs?
The Tigers and St George as well. St George are apparently in a bit of financial strife, and the Sharks are in the midst of redevelopment. Apparently, really the only clubs that are completely safe are Brisbane, Melbourne, Souths, and the Roosters.
Well, that'd be a shit comp, wouldn't it? Like, you do a fucking quad series. That'd be awful. So let's hope that this is obviously not the case. There's going to have to be some urgent funding packages. We already know that they've delved into their war chest to try to prop up the clubs as much as they can. And only today I was reading that Peter V'landys is going to approach the New South Wales government to try to tap into that $800 million fund to originally reconfigure ANZ Stadium, essentially saying, can you call that off because we need to give urgent funding to our clubs. That I'll have to say...
Well, that'll make Peter FitzSimons happy. He's been calling for that.
Oh, well, finally. Something makes him happy. The last time he was happy was when he had his bald head circumcised. Now, look...
You're just not going to let it go.
No, he was quite rude. He was quite rude. No, but the first thing, the thought bubble I had when this whole thing broke was, I think if we need urgent funding, it's this whole Stadia deal that's going to have to be the first thing to chop into, surely. I think the same goes for the Sydney Football Stadium at Moore Park as well. I think that, for me, there's been a huge amount of money outlaid there. Not everything, as we know, one of them's a dust pile. Not a lot's been done yet. All they've done is essentially get a wrecking ball and knock it all to the ground and then get Barnesy in there.
I was going to say, don't sell it short, mate. They filmed a heck of a 30-minute ad campaign there.
They really did. I loved it.
30-second ad campaign, sorry, not 30.
So, look, there's a couple of areas there where I think they could actually get some funding. Do you think there's some credence in that idea and trying to work with the Premier, Berejiklian, to say, look, okay, we're on your side now. We don't want these stadiums. Can we please have that money because we really need it?
Yeah, it seems like in an extreme time like this, it's a pretty rational pool of money to be going for. The tricky part is, of course, that stadium money, I guess it'd have to be split between all the codes who are going to use those stadiums. So it'd have to go partially to rugby, it'd have to go partially to soccer.
But would that be proportionally, surely? I mean, you'd hope that the NRL would get the lion's share there.
Well, if it was proportionally, it would still proportionally go more to the NRL because there are more NRL games, more rugby league games played at those stadia.
And don't leave out the Balinese European handball team because obviously they use it every second Thursday and they will be devastated that they don't have the same ground that they wanted originally, especially since the 04 tsunami. They've been crying out for a home ground. Now, that's out of taste. Didn't need to say that.
Just went to a whole new level.
For some reason, I do tend to go to apocalyptic sort of scenes in history. I don't know how I manage to do it, but on a daily basis, I'm often referring to things looking like the back of JFK's head post being shot. That's the description of something that looks inordinately messy. So it's an odd thing to do.
Strangely apt right now, though.
Well, he does, right?
Maybe you're onto something.
The NRL could certainly be described like that. Now, look, I don't want to linger on Gavin Badger.
JFK's head? Oh, sorry.
No, I don't want to linger on it. But interestingly, when I was reading this article, he actually backed Peter V'landys's assessment that the players were safer if they were moved to a community and in a more controlled environment, which I found quite interesting and it sort of, I guess, supports some of the sentiment that what we're putting forward. Not that we've ever categorically put an idea forward. We're just having a chat about the merit of certain ideas. But certainly a lot of people have been flayed alive in the media for suggesting such things. Do you think there's a level of hysteria here? And I hate to use that word because clearly this is a very serious health crisis. So I'm not referring to COVID-19 itself. But what I'm saying is when you're posing ideas, for example, what the NRL are doing with the idea of potentially isolating the competition in that audacious plan, the reception that it's getting either in mainstream media or even online, it's a bit disappointing to see it reduced. There's a real reductive argument against it that you're somehow some kind of coronavirus denier. It kind of irritates me.
Yeah, that was what I was pushing back on as well, to be completely frank. I've simultaneously, probably confusing to some people, but simultaneously been chastising those trying to minimise the severity of this thing, whilst also saying that, well, if this is possible, the NRL should be allowed to pursue it. And I think that's because they're not mutually exclusive, as we said before. I think that if you're going to be somewhere where there is incredibly low risk, then fundamentally it's like playing it without the preconditions that we're facing now. It's like playing it in, effectively in 2019 conditions, just in a dingy outback town, So I couldn't, and I never saw somebody present an argument as to why. I couldn't see what the risk was if they were able to manage all those variables. So, as I said, granted, it would be hard. Maybe it was simply that there was skepticism that the NRL would have the ability to manage so many moving parts. Which is
a fair criticism. It may have struggled.
Something I can understand, but if they had managed to do it and if they had the right advice in place, if they were willing to effectively take out, hire more people to manage it, get like a logistics company to manage their supply chains and do all that kind of stuff. Probably would have cost them quite a bit, but would have left them with less financial burdens than not going on at all.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, because it seems as though the NRL have little choice. It is either it was to play on this year at some point or perish, at least perish in the current form. If we don't play this year, there's zero doubt that the competition in 2021 will look quite different. I think we will see a reduced competition, for example. I think we will see way less. The idea of expansion, forget about it. That's been knocked back 10 years. The idea of having all of these support staff and trying to implement world's best practice, well, you can try your best, but you're going to be on a skeleton staff now. So these are the kind of things that I guess I was trying to consider economically, and I think that, you know, these plans might sound Bond villainish, but if it's the choice between economic oblivion and attempting to pull a rabbit out of the hat, I just thought that the Australian spirit was to attempt to try to pull the rabbit out of the hat. That's all.
Yeah, like I said, I think the response was a combination of skepticism that they could pull it off, and also just a general sort of cultural bias within certain segments of the Australian community against the NRL. There are a lot of people who like to, for a variety of reasons, you know, shit on the NRL whenever they get the opportunity, whether or not it's fair or not.
There's a bit of class. There's a bit of classism going on, if you ask me, in some of these comments. Yeah. Have you noticed the amount of times that the NRL are being referred to as children and they need to join the adults? I mean, it really shits me when people use those kind of analogies, as though NRL people are lesser people, or somehow you're just a bunch of truck drivers. And it's like, sorry, truck drivers are the salt of the earth. Like, we need blue-collar people in this world. I will support them at any possible juncture against some classist fuckwit. I'll tell you that much.
My favourite has been some news limited journalists having a crack at the NRL, and I thought, Jesus, you guys are in a glass house right now. You've got no idea how ridiculous that sounds. I've seen a few of them. There's that bloke from the Australian that we interacted with didn't really respond to the fact that
Peter Lair or something, is that his name?
Yeah, when we pointed out that he's writing for a publication that actively minimised this and effectively contributed potentially to the number of cases and the way that they've flippantly been disregarding it for a long time.
Yeah, so he was having a go at the NRL for trying to push on using health science logic, but writing for a paper which is continually denying climate change.
And early on, was saying this was a beat-up.
Exactly,
frankly.
yeah. So, I mean, as you said, certain glass houses going on. Look, just a bit of a reflection on Twitter. I thought you might enjoy this. I actually tweeted back to the Badge after I read that article, and I said, mate, look, I wish you all the best, and I hope that you land on your feet soon. And in true Twitter form, someone else also retweeted and said, fuck you, Badger. How many times did you fuck the Tigers in the arse? That was from Brendan G. at Liquid E98. It's even a great handle. Isn't Twitter an amazing place?
It is the cesspool of humanity. It really is.
All right, mate. Look, I thought I might move on from here, and just some interesting stories that I literally pulled out today, because we haven't had a lot of time to prepare for this show, let's be honest, because the world ended, and that could be quite occupying. But I thought this was interesting. I don't know if you saw this. During the week, this is before it all completely imploded, the NRL was saying to players, please stay off Tinder. Whatever you do, don't go on Tinder during this health crisis, because they're obviously still supposed to be on lockdown, right? And of course, they said the same thing to the Bulldogs. They said, don't get on one of those Naplan websites. Stay off there. You're not allowed on that. So there's some holes in this plan, isn't there? Because the players were supposed to be on lockdown. There's definitely some pieces missing from this puzzle. Players are supposed to be on lockdown, and yet they're obviously using Tinder. Otherwise, they wouldn't need to issue a warning. And also, we all know that Latrell Mitchell went up the North Coast and basically interacted with every single person in town. So it sort of comes back to our point. I think that we were actually at a lot more peril staying in the metropolitan areas, because players just aren't following this advice. They actually needed something drastic to happen.
Yeah, you probably needed to effectively do the Antarctica option, figuratively speaking. Maybe literally speaking.
I'm pretty sure Volandis would have an ice lair in Antarctica, because he is a Bond villain. Look, there's some interesting stories in the midst here. Obviously, the Roosters were supposed to have Josh Morris join us from this week.
Love it.
How weird is his week, honestly?
But I just love that we had 2 weeks where we were disrupted with injury somehow the first 2 weeks of the year, where we're still trying to get our captain back. All this shit's going down. struggling to just find the right solutions. And just on the week we're supposed to have a big piece of that puzzle come back along with our captain, the competition gets put on hiatus.
Yeah, it just implodes. I mean, from a personal standpoint, Josh Morris, socially speaking, is that a weird one for him? Because he's just come into the playing group. He's literally just meeting them that day going, hey, boys, it's great to be here. And then they find out in that same meeting that the NRL is suspended for God knows how long. Does he still need to hang with our squad? I mean, what are the social rules there? Because they don't really know him.
Yeah, I wonder if are the clubs even still allowed to train at this point?
Well, no, that's a really interesting question. Yeah, so they were talking about the fact that if there is a hiatus and they come back in September, there will need to be a mini pre-season to get everyone in shape again, because essentially they can't go and train together. Everyone's in self-isolation. So that's sort of a problem in itself.
Yeah, it's a good question, because, I mean, you could have seen this as if they were allowed to still train and conduct all of their drills and combination work and all the rest of it. That would be a good opportunity for them to really build those combinations up.
Can they do that on Google Hangouts? Is there a way that we can sort of move this online for a little bit?
I think Google Hangouts probably isn't the right way to do it. Maybe We Play.
I don't even know what that is, mate.
It?
Mate, I'm in my 30s. What the fuck's that?
It's the Nintendo. No, it's a different thing. There was the Nintendo Wii, where everyone was using the little hand gesture thingies.
Oh, yep.
I've ruined a bit now.
That's all right, mate. I mean, you're on the voluntary tackle. It was ruined to begin with. You never start with a nice, ripe piece of fruit. You're really dealing with something that's quite meshy and unwholesome from the beginning. So by all means.
Like a Nintendo console.
Exactly. Like Nintendo trying to be relevant in the noughties. I mean, what are they thinking?
That's right. It's actually no longer the noughties.
No, that's right. But this is when they were... Didn't the Wii come out then? I'm sure it did.
It's now the 20s. Can you believe that?
Yeah, it's fucking weird. And who knew that the world would end in the 20s? I had the cheek at the beginning of this year's end to go, you know what? I think this is going to be a good year. I said that on New Year's Eve. I said that to my wife. I said, I think...
And you said that in the midst of bushfires. I love it. Like, you're a cockeyed optimist and a half. You said that when the air was unbreathable.
I told her through my air set, I said, I think it's going to be a good year. So anyway, look, it obviously hasn't turned out that way. The year has turned into a piece of shit, but I am, as you said, a cockeyed optimist just by nature. You've known me for a while. I always feel like everything in the end will work out. Of course, there are moments in history which defy that logic. If you were a Jewish person in 1931 in Austria, probably not the case. But generally speaking, again, it all comes back to Hitler, doesn't it? But generally speaking, I think it does.
You keep demonstrating Godwin's law.
Another weird one, Harry Grant and Paul Momorowski, they've just swapped. They just swapped clubs this week, right before the announcement.
Wow.
It all went through. For some reason, there was a shitty delay, and it would have worked out well for all parties. Again, do they just fly straight home now? Like this Momorowski, he's in Melbourne, in lockdown. I mean, what's he going to do?
Yeah, no, there's been a lot of those. I mean, the thing with something like this, though, and I've kind of been finding this a little bit where I work as well, is that the crisis, whilst you're aware of it and it's humming in the background, all of the things you've been planning to do, the projects you've been working on, that are likely to get impacted by things like a shutdown and all the rest of it, you still have to keep pushing on with the planning, because you just don't know if it's going to all go to shit or not. Like, you can't just, you know what I mean? It's a little bit like if this was a major exam for a university student or something like that, and they were just hoping it'd get cancelled, so they thought, fuck it, I'm not going to study. And then somehow it doesn't get cancelled until the day after your exam. You just kind of got to keep pushing forward on the assumption that you're still going to have to deliver until it's absolutely clear that you're not, and there's not going to be anything for you to do.
Is it in that same vein of logic then, Xander, people should also be planning for the fact that there isn't going to be a 2020 season? Should players be looking at securing other work? I already heard Josh Morris say he's at TAFE at the moment doing carpentry. He's like, I'm probably going to be on the tools. later this year.
Yeah, no, I mean, if I were a professional football player, I would absolutely be looking at all my options immediately, because I mean, you don't know how long this is going to last. It could get worse. It's almost certain to get worse before it gets better. So you make sure you keep those links and do whatever you need to do for the club. But obviously, they're going to start cutting back payments and requirements for players as they fight to keep alive, right?
Absolutely. Look, there's been a fair bit of acceptance. I think it's probably the right way of describing it across the rugby league community. All of the clubs have sort of issued statements saying, well, this sucks, but I guess it had to happen. And I'm not sure, have you ever had a chance yet to see Ricky Stewart's video today?
No, I've seen images of it bouncing around. I've actually haven't seen the video itself, though.
Well, I think to see it, and I've shout this out to you too, listeners, if you haven't seen it, definitely check it out, because the visuals is probably what's most so striking about it, because for some reason Ricky Stewart is filming, because everyone's filming on webcams and on their phones at the moment, right? Because obviously they're not allowed into studios. So Ricky Stewart is filming his message of support for the NRL's decision by filming right up his own nostrils. I have no idea under what circumstances Ricky Stewart is thinking, well, this is the only way that this camera can capture my face. It needs to be down by my navel, looking straight up at me. It's a really unusual look. And I have no idea what he said, because I was too fixated on looking at every fucking nostril hair.
He's an older gentleman at this stage.
You ageist prick.
And I can tell you from experience, when I've had parents attempt to FaceTime me, they don't really know how to make it work properly, and you do tend to get a few less than flattering angles with older people.
That's all right, mate. There won't be many of them left soon, so you won't have to put up with them for too much longer. Just let that hang there. You love doing that, don't you?
Yeah. Sometimes I think it's good to allow some of your more brutal and what's the term?
Callous
comments just hang in the air for a moment.
That's right, mate. You know what that is? That's dickhead shaming. Don't do that to me. I don't like it. Look, this is an unusual episode, Xander. Everything's been in a bit of a state of flux, including our respective work lives. So apologies to the listeners if they're probably going, what the fuck are they talking about this episode? There's no sequence to it. There's no real shape. I am here to tell you, listeners, that we will be putting out regular content. We will be hopefully returning to top form, even without a competition. So, Xander, keep your eyes peeled for other sports going on around the world, or at least, I don't know, virtual sports. We'll come up with something.
There are none. There's no sports going on anywhere in the world now.
Look, mate, is there anything that it's sort of been burning your noodle? That's a horrible expression. I'm not saying you've dipped your penis into a hot bath. What I'm saying is there been sort of something that's been vexing for you in the rugby league world in the last week, something you want to get off your chest?
Not so much something I want to get off my chest. I guess I've more been curious as to what the competition would look like in a reduced format, say next year, if things go really bad, I mean, and callously, which I'm sure you'll appreciate, wondering if it could be a long-term improvement to the competition if it rationalised Sydney somewhat. We've discussed this before.
Yeah, and look, and I'm against rationalisation, but I think you might see some merit to it. But yeah, I'm just one of these guys that I guess have grown up with the NRL, and I'm prepared to cop change if it's expansion. But part of me just doesn't want to see another club go, because I just love them all. They're like, I don't know, like it's weird. It almost feels like your favourite possessions, and if you get rid of one, you've lost the set. That's kind of how I feel about rugby league. I don't want any of them to go. And I know there's a lot of hypocrisy there, because a lot of it has been rationalised, and now I go for the St George Illawarra Dragons, and I don't go for them, but I support their existence. I support the Wests Tigers' existence. But yeah, part of me just doesn't want to see any further rationalisation. So I look at these prospects pretty dimly myself, even though I think that there is an economic reality that's something we're going to have to be prepared to potentially see next year, which I think would be really tragic.
Yeah, we'll wait and see, I guess. I mean, as you said before, maybe they dip into that pot of stadium money and the thing gets solved that way. But yeah, It'll be interesting. We'll put it that way.
Look, we'll finish on this note, Xander. If the competition is scrapped, how do we know who the winner is this year? Will there be no winner, or will it be adjudicated on the basis of who won last year? Yes, please. Or will it be adjudicated on the fact of who's winning now, which is the Parramatta Eels? I don't know if you know this yet. I put this out on Twitter, and I think a whole bunch of other people have as well. Just by chance, did you know that the West Tigers are currently 9th?
Yes, I did.
How amazing is that?
Funny.
They just can't help themselves, can they?
It would be, yeah. Look, I mean, it's been noted by more than a few fans that it's just their luck to end up exactly where they did last year after 2 rounds. But no, I suspect, I mean, you can't award any sort of result after 2 rounds. It's just ridiculous for a 26-round competition. So they'll just pretend. I suspect they'll wipe the slate clean and say, look, the last championship just remains the 2019 premiership, and so the Roosters will remain the incumbent premiers.
You have a dog in that race, that's for sure. And look, I think it'd be quite apt if they gave it to the Eels, because Eels fans generally think they have won the comp after 2 rounds.
Yeah, so do St George fans, to be fair. But,
that is true.